let's get this underway. So, must be that time of year again. Happy Halloween! Do you know, I never usually get scared of things. Well, not all the time. I mean, yeah, sure, of course, maybe a few things might...
Right, that's it, I'm done. No.
Okay, you've made your point. Horror games scare the ever-living shite out of me. So what? It's normal. But there is one franchise that doesn't particularly scare me, but I do appreciate its creepy atmosphere, and that's the Forbidden Siren series. I've already covered Forbidden Siren 1, and I didn't really like it as much as I thought I did back in the early 2000s. And I also played Forbidden Siren 2, and I reviewed both those games on my channel. And Forbidden Siren 2 was a big improvement to Forbidden Siren 1. But what about the reimagining of the series? What about the remake of the original game? What about Siren Blood Curse? I already briefly mentioned it in my review of Forbidden Siren 2, but I always said to myself that I would like to go back and try out Siren Blood Curse to get an honest take on what the game is actually like, and my opinion of it in general.
Siren Blood Curse was ultimately a bittersweet instalment for the series as a whole, as it was the developers' final attempt to try and win the series over with Western audiences after the original game failed to meet their expectations, and the sequel ended up being locked out of the United States, only selling in Europe and Japan. Blood Curse was made in such a way that it included certain elements that American audiences would have preferred, and it was received well, but sales wise it didn't do well. And Blood Curse ended up being the ironic curse of the series that ended its run, never to have any further instalments. There are many differences between Blood Curse and the original game, however, that I cannot wait to talk about.
So, if this is your first time here, then welcome to GB Reviews. This is Dave talking to you on GB Gaming, where video games come first. This is episode 23 and the 4th Halloween special for the channel. Thanks for coming and welcome. I hope you enjoy the video. Happy Halloween, and let's go.
Developed once again by Project Siren and released in 2008 exclusively for the PlayStation 3, Siren Blood Curse was released in Japan as Siren New Translation and serves as a reimagining of the original Forbidden Siren. Interestingly enough, it's specifically regarded as an Americanized remake, and like I said at the beginning, was created to appeal more to a Western audience. Characters are effectively changed to North American people, mostly Caucasian, with the exception of one of African descent, ultimately having typically Western names in the process. Other elements were altered, such as the behaviour of most of the female cast, which caters more to the strong female standard in contrast to the vulnerable archetype we saw in the original game. All of this is more of a cosmetic shift and doesn't really impact the most important aspects of the game, that being the story, gameplay, among other aspects, so let's not waste any more time. I said remake, and that's more or less what this game is at surface level. But what Blood Curse sets out to be is more of a reimagining, a reboot if you will. Instead of the characters we saw in Forbidden Siren, Blood Curse introduces us to American characters which more or less have the same roles as the original characters. Howard and Amana, for example, represents the roles of Kyoka and Hisako respectively. As with the original game, the story centres around an event that happens in a mysterious village called Hanyuda. A natural disaster occurs, and instead of the water in the village simply turning red, it turns into blood, which makes more sense to a dumb westerner like myself. It also causes the rain to turn into blood as well. It makes sense for it to be blood and not water, because the original game contradicts itself by saying that the red water is the blood of Datatsushi. So if it was supposed to be blood, then just make it blood to begin with. Years later, an American TV crew decides to investigate the village for paranormal activity. A couple of members of the aforementioned TV crew stumble upon a ceremony in which a sacrifice has just happened and another man, known as Howard, tries to intervene. This scene is a little bit different from the original, not in terms of what happened, but in terms of exposure. In the original game, we basically see the whole ritual take place. In Blood Curse, however, the scene is shot from a found footage perspective and is mostly obscured. After Howard makes an attempt to flee the area, he is chased by a policeman called Shuji, and it's here where the game begins and we take control of Howard. It's during this encounter that we realise that Shuji, the cop, is no ordinary cop. Once the titular siren sounds, most of the village residents are reanimated into the aforementioned Shibito, which, if you haven't watched any of my previous reviews for Forbidden Siren 1 and 2, they are basically zombies if they were actually intelligent. The narrative of the game centres around Howard and every other human trying to survive the village's curse. As with the previous games, the objectives can be a little vague. It took me multiple attempts to figure out what to do. Hitting the cop didn't do anything, and neither did hitting him across the head with a bottle. It wasn't before I realised that I had to escape up this small hill and progress to a nearby shelter. This was my first experience with Blood Curse, but I eventually got it. So it's no surprise nor secret that, despite me enjoying the style of the Siren series, the gameplay of both Siren 1 and 2 was not my cup of tea. I did not like the outdated controls, the awkward camera, and the frustratingly slow animations. It all made an otherwise stunning couple of horror games very aggravating to play. Long story short, Siren Blood Curse fixes almost every aspect of these vexations. The famous sight-jacking ability has been altered to allow for a split-screen mode. This allows you to continue controlling your character while still having the ability to see where the enemy is at the cost of a few frames per second. You no longer need to press a button to go through a list of commands in order to do simple tasks like turning on a flashlight. You can now select these commands by pressing a button on the D-pad. Other new additions such as bracing doors, attacking while moving, finisher moves, and the complete omission of the link navigator makes Siren Blood Curse a much more streamlined experience that I personally find much easier to play. The removal of the aforementioned link navigator also means there are no more secondary missions that you need to complete, which means you no longer need to replay levels multiple times to get certain outcomes or items. This was a huge problem for me in the original games, which caused me to feel like the games were being unnecessarily padded out to increase the game's length. Each mission now comes in the form of episodes and plays out like an episodic format, where each time you finish a mission, you are met with a next time preview for the next mission, and as such, when the next mission begins, you are met with a recap of the previous mission that you had just finished, so that if you plan on coming back to this game a few days later, you're not entirely lost from a narrative perspective. As a result, the time to complete the game is cut almost entirely in half, making the game beatable in roughly 10 to 12 hours instead of the 20 plus hours that the original game took. Personally, this suited me down to the ground. In theory, it's everything I wanted the original two games to play like and more, and it took a remake to get to that point. The game also allows you to change the camera view. You can have the character slightly to the left of the camera, similar to Forbidden Siren 2, or you can change it to Type B, which is the perspective of the camera sitting directly behind the character, like in Siren 1. Likewise with Siren 2, you can switch to a first person perspective and play the entire game that way if you choose. You can even turn off the sight jacking split screen separation if it becomes intrusive.
Does that mean that the gameplay is the best? Yes, it's the best, but does that make the game good? Does that make the game fun? Yes and no. Let me explain.
When you're just exploring areas and stealthily avoiding enemies and finding items, the game is incredibly enjoyable. The atmosphere adds to it. But when you're actively fleeing from enemies or trying to attack them, it's a different story. Even though the controls are greatly improved over Forbidden Siren 1 and 2, this is still a Siren title, and with that it can still be frustrating to play. The right stick still controls the camera in a peripheral sense, rather than allowing you to rotate the character. The game still requires you to control the character entirely with the left stick.
Yeah, when Siren 1 first originally released, it had a lot of problems regarding the controls. A lot of this was alleviated in Forbidden Siren 2. And in Siren Bloodcurse, even more things were alleviated, but it still wasn't quite right. The developers just didn't quite get there, and I found that incredibly frustrating, because Forbidden Siren 1 was released in 2003, Forbidden Siren 2 was released in 2006, and Siren Bloodcurse was released in 2008. Do you know what else was released in 2008? Dead Space. And it goes without saying, this is incredible. It controls miles better than Siren Bloodcurse. So, if your option was to choose either this or Siren Bloodcurse, I'd go with this. Unfortunately, I didn't know this game existed until about a year later. Go figure.
In my books, Project Siren, the developer, had no excuse not perfecting this very important aspect. Even Manhunt 2, released the previous year, had similar stealth elements and controlled much better. At this point in the series' lifespan, it could have been done much better than this. The camera also became a nuisance at times, especially when in tight spaces and trying to escape enemies at the same time. I found myself going back to what I did in Siren 2, and that was playing most of the game in a first-person perspective, because I could at least see where I was going, and the field of vision was also greatly increased. Siren Bloodcurse also makes use of the PlayStation 3's 6-axis motion control capabilities, allowing you to jerk the controller to complete specific actions. It's mostly optional. You can reload by either jerking the controller to the left or by pressing the assigned reload button on the controller, but the only time I had no choice but to shake the controller was when I was being grabbed or thrown to the ground by enemies. Shaking the controller allows you to break free. Overall, the game was just another improvement, but still retained the irritating tropes that the first two games had, and the puzzles were often ridiculously obtuse as well. I even had to look up a guide for one of them. This was probably my own fault, as I tend to get stupid when it comes to this aspect. That's why I cannot stand games like The Witness, or why I tend to struggle with the original Resident Evil. It's also why it took me about 40 minutes to complete one of the levels in this game. A lot of trial and error at times as well. Nevertheless, my point stands. It was more enjoyable, but that doesn't mean it was overall great.
You were gasping so hard. I thought you were one of them.
No, not them again.
I can't watch this anymore.
Is she the actress that you guys hired?
One thing I noticed almost immediately when playing this game for the first time was the way the characters looked. Everyone is now fully animated with 3D rendered facial expressions instead of the 2D digitised look everyone had in the original. A personal disappointing change for me, as I kind of liked how they looked originally. It fit the style. And speaking of style, the tone of the game remains largely similar as before. The grainy Silent Hill-esque atmosphere is retained, combined with the addition of brilliant lighting effects that really work for the game, taking advantage of the PS3's visual capabilities at the same time. At times it felt a little too dark, and I found myself not seeing much of a difference when turning the brightness up. This led to a lot of frustrating elements when exploring some of the levels, because I didn't really see where I was going. The flashlight only did so much. The creepy music from Siren 1 makes its return here, with additional sound effects thrown in. One of my biggest complaints about Siren Bloodcurse though was the fact I could barely hear the characters speak. This was slightly alleviated thanks to the game's built-in midnight mode, but you have to make sure that you have surround sound turned on in the PlayStation 3's audio settings. Basically, the game sounds its best when wearing surround sound headphones, or a surround sound speaker setup if you have one. The sound effects in the game, as a result, are much more clearer than they were in the original game, but there's one thing I don't really enjoy, and that's the muffled audio that you hear when you are in sightjacking mode. Summing up my entire opinion into this one section, I'm happy to report that Siren Bloodcurse is a very worthy reimagining of a rather dated franchise, at least from a gameplay perspective. It's a shame, however, that the sequel may never get the same treatment. As I said in the beginning of this review, it's ironic in a way that the final game ended up being the curse that caused the series to fail going forward. It didn't sell as well as the developers would have liked, despite getting positive feedback from critics and players alike. It sits at a 72 on Metacritic, with the user score being slightly higher at 7.9 out of 10. I feel bad for the developer, to be honest, because they really tried to get the style of the game to go over with Western audiences, but it just didn't sit well with that part of the world. It was ultimately the reason why Siren 2 never made it to the United States, because the original game was not well liked by many in that country. Bloodcurse, as I said, was their final attempt to win the game over with Western gamers, but it was sadly too little, too late. The Siren series didn't become as big a franchise as they intended, and ultimately killed the franchise. As of this video, there may never be another game in the Siren universe. Project Siren, the developers, would go on to create Gravity Rush and its eventual sequel, changing their name in the process to Team Gravity, before ultimately being merged with Sony's Japan studio. The future of the Forbidden Siren franchise may look like it's up in the air, but I do not see it returning, and that sucks. It really does. With that being said, we have come to the end of this Halloween special and the end of this review.
If you made it this far into the review, then thank you very much for taking the time to watch it. And if you enjoyed what you saw and you want to see more, then you know exactly what to do. If you want to listen to my podcast series, you can always go onto Spotify and find GB Gaming Podcast and hit the follow button if you wish. The episodes are also available on YouTube, should you prefer it there. But with that said, thanks again for taking the time to watch this. This has been Dave talking to you on GB Gaming, where video games come first. Happy Halloween, stay safe, and I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks again, and cheerio.